All righty. I hate not being able to see everybody, but good morning, everyone. My name is Shelley Gentile, and I'm the program manager for the Institute for Water and Environmental Resilience at Stetson University. On behalf of the Volusia Water Alliance, welcome to the first program of our virtual symposium series. As you may know, we host a symposium every year at the Sanborn Center in DeLand, but because of the pandemic, this virtual series will serve as a stand-in for that event. And we hope and expect really to resume our in-person format next fall. Before starting our program, let me remind our Stetson students that in order to receive cultural credit for your attendance, you'll need to email your Stetson ID number to me at sgentile, SGENTILE at stetson.edu at the end of today's program. And we'll put that address up on the screen at the end also. So today we are honored to have award-winning author and historian Rick Kilby with us today to present Restoring Balance, Reflections on Florida's Waters, Past, Present, and Future. This presentation is going to explore the history of some of Volusia County's watery places, as well as examine the current condition of springs and groundwater in the Middle St. Johns River Basin. Finally, we will consider solutions and ideas for restoring the water bodies that help define the quality of life in the region. It's my pleasure to introduce your moderator for today's program, Dr. Jason Evans. Since last summer, he has served as the interim executive director of Stetson University's Institute for Water and Environmental Resilience, and he is also the co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Environmental Management. Trained as a landscape ecologist, Jason is one of the nation's leading researchers and practitioners in the field of coastal resilience and climate adaptation planning. He's also an expert on Florida springs ecology and management, with a special focus on aquatic plants, his favorite being water lettuce, of course. As a native of Orlando who spent many childhood days on the St. Johns River, he's very proud and honored to work with so many folks who are committed to the protection of our incredibly unique river of lakes. Jason will also be joining Rick later for questions and discussion, but let me just give you fair warning that due to a little emergency that he's in the middle of, Jason might have to leave us a little bit early, and we'll just have to pretend that he's still here. So without further ado, let's get started. Dr. Evans, over to you.
Yeah, well, great. Well, thank you so much, though, Shelley. And yeah, this is really a treat of this program here with Rick Kilby and talking about the St. Johns River. And so, yeah, I grew up in Orlando and seeing what happened just over the 1980s. And so the little story that I always give is when I was a kid, there was a fence and there were woods. And I was on the eastern side of Orange County. And it was right at the edge. And so the subdivision that I grew up in, that was the easternmost one just about. So I'd explore in woods and swamps and streams and creeks. I'd go fishing on the St. Johns River. I'd go down the Kissimmee River Basin, the lakes down there. I'd go fishing. And watching through the 80s, as all the subdivisions started moving east in all the areas I used to explore. And so this landscape I have in my head that I just absolutely cherished as a kid, it's gone. It's absolutely gone. It's all been converted into something else. And that's not that long ago, I don't think. You know, you think of the 80s and, you know, that's kind of color TV and Hairspray and MTV. And, you know, it's now 30, 40 years ago now, but it's not that long ago. And seeing the changes within springs and our waters, I grew up thinking that waters were actually getting cleaner, the Clean Water Act, and we had seen a lot of improvement from the 60s into the 80s. And so it's been a real shock of my life and a real kind of disappointment that over the past 30 years or so, things haven't been getting cleaner within Central Florida. We've seen springs declining. We've seen our waters declining. And that's really upsetting, just kind of truly upsetting. And that's the reason why I'm actually doing what I'm doing. The reason why I became an environmental scientist was because I was so upset about what was happening around me. I want to save the world. I want to save Central Florida. I mean, that's really, that goes back to being a kid. And so the program today really gets into this. And so again, I'm really happy here with Rick Kilby. And so I'm just going to introduce you, Rick, if that's okay.
Sure.
So Rick Kilby, he is from Gainesville, Florida, and he looked for shark's teeth. He swam in springs and waded through swamps as a kid, just like I did. So that's I can see why we're fast friends. He's also a Florida graduate, which I am as well. He has earned his living as a graphic designer since 1986, and he has been self-employed for almost 20 years. He was inspired by a trip to the Fountain of Youth in St. Augustine. And so from that, he created a blog about the history and culture of Florida. His Old Florida blog has over 880,000 views, and his Old Florida Facebook is followed by over 58,000 people, which I'm one of those. He's also an academic of sorts, so he's also given papers at all sorts of conferences that include the Society for Commercial Archaeology. He is the managing editor for the Reflections from Central Florida magazine, and also the Journal of the Historical Society of Central Florida. His first book, Finding the Fountain of Youth, was published in 2013 and won a Florida Book Award in the visual arts category. And it's a wonderful book. It's on my shelf. His second book, Florida's Healing Waters, was recently published by the University Press of Florida. Rick's mission is to motivate other Floridians to appreciate and preserve the natural and the historic wonders of our state. So with that, Rick, I'm going to go and turn this over to you. And I am really excited to hear your talk.
Thank you, Jason. We'll call on you at different points throughout the presentation to add important bits of information. I want to dedicate this talk to Bill Belleville. Hopefully people in the audience are familiar with Bill and his work. And if you're not, you've got to get some of his books, because he is kind of the bard of the St. Johns River. He influenced my work incredibly. You know, he has a spiritual perspective about the waters as well as ecology and history, and he blended all those. Well, the story I want to tell is I too have a relationship as a kid with the St. Johns River. I grew up in Gainesville, but on the weekends, starting in 4th grade all the way through college, we would go to Willaca. Everybody else was going to Crescent Beach and having a great time at the beach. We were fishing for bass and going up the Ocklawaha River. And it's kind of my baseline. That's why I love the St. Johns River, and that's why I love the natural environment of Florida. And but it was kind of a recreational relationship. It was more about fishing and boating than anything else. But when I came across Bill Belleville's book, A River of Lakes, it changed my perspective. And so my relationship with the St. Johns River and the area went from very superficial to a much more deeper relationship, because I learned about the history and ecology. The place where we went every weekend was Beecher Point, right across to the mouth of the Ocklawaha. I had no idea that giant steamboats would go up that river all the time. And it just kind of opened my eyes. And that's what kind of, my foray into getting a deeper relationship, a deeper understanding of the river of the St. Johns was through history and ecology as told by Bill Belleville. I'm going to steal a joke from NPR. Have you ever bought a book for your dad for Christmas but not give it to him till his birthday because you read the book first? I have, and that's what River of Lakes meant to me. I also want to talk about another book that had a great influence on my work, and it's kind of the thesis for this whole talk. This is a book called The Florida Reader that was written by two professors from Rollins College, Saki O'Sullivan and Jack Lane. One's a historian, one's an English professor, and it traces the literary tradition of Florida. And they say it's the longest literary tradition in all of North America because it goes back to the age of the conquistadors over 500 years ago. But their whole notion is that there are two different narratives that have been used historically when writing about Florida. And they both go back to the Garden of Eden story in the Bible and the story in the book of Genesis. And one narrative is represented by this beautiful picture of the St. John's, and this other narrative is represented by gathering oranges. So the first narrative is Florida as a paradise, and it comes from the very first story of Garden of Eden, and these two stories run right next to each other in the book of Genesis. And the first one is that the Garden of Eden is created by God with man in it, and it's paradise, and everything you need is right there. You don't need to do anything else but enjoy the land of milk and honey. Florida is the Garden of Eden. It's perfect the way it is. It's a narrative of unity, which shapes a lot of way I think environmentalists picture Florida. And to me, this is the perfect pictorial representation of that. It's so literal. There is a cornucopia, a horn of plenty, and it's the shape of Florida, and flowers are landing in the water where there's a bevy of beautiful naked maidens. Florida is paradise. The second narrative, which really shapes the way so many people look at Florida today, is that Florida is a land of potential. So this came right after the first narrative in the Bible, and it's man is put into the Garden of Eden, but they have to work it and take care of it. It's the narrative of land of cows and bees, and the narrative of dominion. Man has dominion over the land. And that's the narrative you see when the Europeans arrived, starting with Ponce de Leon and then later Pedro Menendez. I was just in St. Augustine where Pedro Menendez established the first colony in the New World, and it's still under construction to this day. They've never completed. But this is a great representation because they are changing the environment around them to suit their needs. They see nature as a resource to be exploited. And my whole idea is that we need more balance in these two narratives because we are grossly out of balance where we think narrative is a resource that is there to suit our needs. And what I'm trying to get at is that we need to see nature is connected to us, and we need to restore the balance. One of the things I've done in my new book is I looked at the collection of 19th century literature that really drew people into the state. And you see both sides of the coin, and you see how people who wanted to really commodify nature used the idea of the Garden of Eden in order to bring people in. Great example on the left, the Eden of the South. Alachua County is the Garden of Eden. And then on the right, it's written by Seth French, who was a big pioneer in the Volusia County history. He established the city of Orange City, and he also helped establish Sanford. And he was the first commissioner of the Bureau of Immigration in 1879 and 1880, which means he was the guy in charge of bringing people to the state of Florida. So his book is about Florida's climate, soil, and productions. It is about dominion over the natural resources of the state. So you see those two again and again and again throughout Florida history. A great example of using that kind of rosy narrative of the Garden of Eden in order to bring people to the state is Harriet Beecher Stowe. Harriet Beecher Stowe was the only book that outsold her book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, in the 19th century was the Bible. She was the woman, when she met Abraham Lincoln, he said, "You're the little lady who started the Great War." She was like Oprah and J.K. Rowling combined. She was a rock star. And so when she moved to Florida and she lived on the St. Johns River in Mandarin up near Jacksonville, she wrote a collection of essays called Palmetto Leaves that had a huge influence on immigration to the state of Florida. So she used this beautiful flowery language like wildflowers tempting the eye on the near banks. This is her description of the St. Johns River. One is constantly longing for the boat to delay here or there, but it goes on a steady course. The picture seen around constantly changing. She used the language of the Garden of Eden. That was 1873. In 1886, a writer from the UK came over who was a Victorian novelist, and she saw it differently. She said those glowing narratives are really just about selling land in Florida. And she said Florida is the best lied about state in the Union. And so you see how the idea of the Garden of Eden is used by people to promote the state and get people to move down here, even though there are people who really believe that it is the Garden of Eden. And it still continues to this day. This is a screenshot from the Visit Florida website. You don't see any attractions. You don't see any lines at attractions. You don't see any traffic jams on I-4. Without I-4, maybe we would be living in paradise. I love the language they use, natural wonders to fantastical journeys of the imagination. It is definitely the narrative of the Garden of Eden used today on the state website. but you will not find any images like this anywhere on the website. If Florida is the Garden of Eden, we have been crappy gardeners. This is the result of an imbalance in our attitude towards the environment over 500 years of seeking to exert our will over nature. In order to restore the environment of the state, I suggest we need to get more people to invest in the notion that Florida is a natural paradise. This is one of my favorite historical images of De Leon Springs. It's great for representing balance, but it also shows, I love this idea, how we remember the land, how we remember the past influences how we treat it today, and that's what I got from Bill Belleville's writing. Learning the history of our water resources helps to realize that these places that have been inspiring poets and artists for generations will make us take a deeper dive into what came before and inspire us to become better stewards of the environment. Restoring balance between these two narratives is essential. We need to realize that taking dominion over nature comes with great responsibility. We have to preserve it for future generations and be better stewards of the land around us. And it makes economic sense to take better care of the environment. So I want to look at some lessons through history. One of the early Spaniards, or the Spanish got here in the 1500s. In the 1700s, they were still around until the 1760s. But this is a quote by a friar who was here, and he looked at the indigenous people and said, they don't sow, they don't work, they are living in the Garden of Eden. And that was the perception of the Spaniards that were here. But we know that perhaps it wasn't that easy because they left great evidence of altering nature around them. This is like a thermal image of a huge amphitheater that was along Silver Glen Springs, which is near the St. Johns River. You just go down the Silver Glen Run. But it was used for religious and ceremonial purposes, and it was created over hundreds and hundreds of years, you know, accumulated shell material to create this for ceremonial uses. So that we know that, you know, while the indigenous people relied on nature, that maybe it wasn't as perfect as we thought because they were actually physically altering the landscape around them. This is one of the smaller shell middens. You can still see a little bit of evidence right next to the spring at Silver Glen Springs. Jason O'Donohue is an architect who writes about spring archaeology for the state, and I recommend his book highly. So this is probably the height of a lot of the shell middens around the Middle St. Johns River Basin. You know, Pontoon Island was known for the big shell mounds. Tick Island in the area around Enterprise had these enormous shell middens and mounds that were destroyed and used as road fill because that whole idea, the whole commodification of nature and using it as a resource, said these were not out of bounds. I don't think we could ever imagine destroying something that had this archaeological material today, but in the late 19th century and early 20th century, it was seen purely as a commodity. We know from some of the archaeology that we have done, however, that the spirituality of the indigenous people who lived here before us was connected deeply to water, and that their spirituality evolved from nature. Bill Belleville talks about Ibi, I-B-I, which is the word that the Timucuan used for nature, and that all the forms of water were just considered Ibi, which was Ibi, or however you say it, is sacred. And Gerald T. Milanich, who is the leading archaeologist in terms of indigenous people in the state, said the Timucua, and let me just clarify, the Timucua were a culture we now know probably came no further south than Lake George. The Mayaca are the people who lived in the Middle St. Johns Basin. But, you know, that's kind of a relatively new discovery. A lot of the writings here, when you talk about the Timucua, is living in this area or are living in the southern part of Volusia County. But Milanich says the Timucua and their pre-Columbian ancestors sought to live in harmony with nature and the supernatural. So their Garden of Eden incorporated their spirituality and grew from their relationship with nature. To me, this is the great representation, the physical representation that is left of their spirituality, and it exemplifies what we still have to learn, because there are so many theories as to what this totem or effigy is that originally was found near Pontoon Island in the St. Johns River. This is a replica that exists today. The original is at Fort Caroline near Jacksonville. I have my own little model of it. But at the bottom, it says Timucuan Altotum circa 1400. We know that's not true. It was the mica. And when you go to Tontoon Island, the interpretation there is still wrong. But what I like what this ranger said, I think it's a sense of wonder, because there are stories that this could tell us that we don't quite understand yet. And there's a lot we can learn from the indigenous people. After all the Timucua and the Mayaca had been wiped out because they had no immunity to the diseases brought by the Europeans, by the late 1700s, they were pretty much gone. There's few survivors. Some went to Cuba with the Spanish when the Spanish left, and some intermarried with the Creeks who moved in and became Seminoles. But there's a tradition with the Seminole Indians too. A lot of the springs that I've studied have kind of origin stories, and most origin stories about springs say that the indigenous people who would at that time have been the Seminole knew about the springs and saw them as sacred places, that if they were fighting against another tribe, they would never fight in the presence of a spring because it was an oasis of peace. And supposedly they wouldn't let anybody live near a spring because it was reserved only for the sick. It was a sacred place of healing. I think there's a lot we could learn from that if we saw springs as sacred oases of peace, we would treat our water a whole lot better. The paradigm shift with the arrival of the Europeans, that the spirituality part that the indigenous people had with nature kind of got thrown out the window because the British, who were the first to really start developing the land and bringing immigrants here and building these big plantations up and down the St. Johns River, really saw the lands of Florida as something, as a resource that they could exploit for money. We know that the Spanish really saw it as a tactical thing, and they had a better relationship with the indigenous people living here. If they said they were Catholics, they would work with them. You know, and the English really didn't have that same kind of relationship. And, you know, the English were responsible for bringing enslaved people here, and they really wanted to develop the state of Florida. To me, the best thing that came out of British in terms of the two narratives has to be Bartram, or William Bartram specifically. And if you haven't been to Volusia County Courthouse and looked at the incredible paintings of Florida history by Jackson Walker, do yourself a favor. You can learn so much just by looking at these incredible paintings. And this is his painting of William Bartram. William Bartram came with his father, John. Originally, John had been hired by King George of England to take a survey of everything in the colonies that they owned in the southern part of what's now the United States. And John said, William, come along, you're just hanging out. And he was a great artist. And William came back later without his father and wrote his book Travels, which is, for Bill Belleville, that was like his Bible. And I think it inspires us to see Central Florida in a completely different way. And I love his language. I love it. And he talks about the basin ornamented with a great variety of fruitful and floriferous trees, shrubs, and plants, the pendant golden orange dancing on the surface of the pellucid waters. He makes us see nature through the eyes of a poet, and he speaks to our soul. There are two places where you're going to find a lot of Bartram mania. One is Palatka, because they have this big Bartram Symposium and Bartram Festival. I think it's in February, March this year. And in Volusia County, you have incredible Bartram resources. I stopped by a couple of weeks on my way to Tontoon Island and was blown away by these incredible interpretive signs in the Bartram Garden that's there at the Aquatic Center. So now I'm going to have Jason come on and talk about the place.
Great. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Rick. And so we have a wonderful site, of course, here at the Aquatic Center with Stetson. And within the Bartram lore, famously, he was hit by a hurricane on Lake Beresford. And we think it was a tornado, actually, with the time of year, or some kind of big windstorm. But of course, being someone like me that's just a scholar of Bartram, or I'd say an amateur scholar, just so exciting that we have a site that has that kind of history. And so what we've been trying to do with our site is really kind of cultivate the spirit of Bartram, and going through and all of the plants that he described as he goes down the St. Johns River in 1774, and trying to bring some of those plants back. And so what we've done in Florida with lakefront sites everywhere, Because you can see within our site that there's grass, lawn, but what we're trying to do is we're trying to reintroduce native plants, pollinator gardens. And so we can go to the next slide as well. And so, and just really talking about our native pollinator plants and with the wonder and the science really that Bartram brings, and trying to bring that into our site and teach about, it's not just like if you have a biology 1 class and you're learning about what the pistil and the pollen and the stigma, that can seem really dry. But then when you're seeing the flowers and seeing the relationships and the symbiosis and the hummingbirds and the bees, and it's absolutely amazing that if we reflect upon our native plants and just kind of look at them, explore them, kind of meditate, just take the time, that's really the spirit that we have there from Bartram, and we're trying to cultivate that within our site.
I think that's one of my favorite lessons I get from Bartram. And I remember this from Bill Belleville, that he taught a class for the Center for Jurisprudence where you went out in nature and you simply were quiet and still and just wrote about it. And I think that's what we get from Bartram, this connection with wild nature, because he was a Quaker, and in his theology, he saw all of nature as a reflection of God. And I think that's one of the things that we can bring to nature, and when we're on the waters, is that connection, that spiritual connection of meditation and enjoying it. Contrast that to what William Bartram's father said, who, when he came to Satsuma Springs, said it was a big fountain, big enough to turn a mill, with a warm, clear water of very offensive taste that smelled like bilge water, which is ironic because I'll talk about the healing springs later. When they started developing spas along the St. Johns River, they wanted that stinky water because it indicated a strong presence of minerals. But he saw it as a commodity. He saw it, well, there's a big flow here. We can use it to turn a mill wheel. So sure enough, people that came after him actually did use mill wheels around springs. The best known, of course, is the De Leon Springs, but in North Florida, there are several springs that were kind of channelized. They created pools around them and used the force of the water coming out to turn mill wheels. Other people saw the water coming out of springs with this strong presence of minerals and the clarity and the purity as a great source of bottled drinking water. So several of these, from a report by the government in 1909, are St. Johns River Springs. You see Benson Springs in Enterprise. Magnolia Springs is up in Clay County. The Orange City mineral water I'll talk about in just a second. Here we go. So when people wanted to have these healing spas, usually they wanted a real stinky water that was sometimes like Green Springs was kind of murky and gross. But if there was a lot of flow, they tended to see them more as recreational resources, and they didn't usually put a spa there. But so Blue Spring was never used, that at least I've been able to tell, as for healing waters. But they sunk a pipe down there and brought up well water in Orange City, and it was recognized as some of the best water anywhere. And that they won a huge award around the turn of the century, what was then the World's Fair, for the quality of the water. And they bottled water. There's stories about how they would ship whole trainloads full down to South Florida for people to drink, and it was extremely popular. There's also a story that John D. Rockefeller, who had a place in Orange Beach, loved Orange City mineral water so much that he took it with him wherever he went, and he would bathe in it. And that's the only water he would drink. I don't know that that's true, but it's a great story. Another one was at Deerfoot Landing on Lake Beersford. There was a water bottling facility, and this was the water. It was a steamboat stop. And I love this description. This is an ad that was in a DeLand paper. And it says, Deerfoot mineral water. After you have learned to like it, you may not care for it at first, but in time you won't care for any other water, which to me indicates it probably had a very strong sulfur taste. That meant it had to be good for you because it tasted bad. Another one was Wakira Springs. And what I like about this, in addition to talking about rheumatism, kidney and bladder trouble, the stuff that it would cure, is this Indian maiden with the two things of water, because all these springs kind of tied into the myth that, or perhaps the fact that indigenous people lived around the springs as a way of indicating a harmony with nature. And that's what was really exploited in the 19th century and early in the 20th century. And today, we know that our water is still bottled heavily throughout the state. that there's places like Zephyr Hills that get their water from Crystal Springs that tap the water. Cynthia Barnett, she wrote a wonderful book called Mirage about Florida's water, and she tells us that a lot of the drinking water taken from the state of Florida is simply tap water. And really, tap water and spring water, it all comes from the same aquifer. And there's still a great deal of controversy around bottling water in the state, in the Santa Fe River. The state has established minimum flow levels, and the Santa Fe is already considered in a dangerous area. And there's fear that if they renew this bottled water permit that's near Jenny Springs, that it will degrade the Santa Fe River even further. And all this bottled water comes from the Floridan aquifer, and this is a representation of just how big this aquifer is. It is one of the most productive aquifer systems in the world. It stretches, you can see, over 5 states. And 90% of the drinking water in the state comes from the Florida aquifer that's below our feet. But here is the reality, thanks to the Florida Springs Institute for this graphic. The part that drinking water, is the commercial wells is very, very small in comparison of the amount of water taken in by agriculture and just our public supply of water. And of our public supply of water, 90 million gallons a day go on our lawns. So I'm gonna get on my high horse today and say, don't have a regular lawn. You need to have Florida natives in your lawn. I just became aware of this guy. He wrote a book called Bringing Nature Home. And he says, turn your yard into a mini national park for the wildlife there. It's gonna be good for the water. It's gonna sequester carbon and feed pollinators. I love that concept. And Jason's gonna talk more about that later. I want to do another history lesson and talk about the meat and potato of my books, which is Gilded Age tourism, who came to the state as invalids. The St. Johns River was the I-95, the I-4 of the late 19th century after the Civil War. People were taking steamboats up and down the river all the time. Northerners, they were coming in winter. They weren't coming in summer. There was no air conditioning. And they would stop at places, you can see DeLand and Sanford were 2 of the big stops. And our buddy Seth French said, mineral springs of great volume are found in every portion of the state. Most of these are medicinal, white sulfur, iron, etc. That is not the case, but he was in charge of immigration to the state of Florida because he's going to say, our water is incredible everywhere you go. I identified 22 or 23 springs in the state that were promoted as places of healing waters that actually had facilities built next to the spring, a resort hotel or a spa. And these are the ones identified on the St. Johns River. And to me, the St. Johns River is most important because that's where the state's tourism industry really developed after the Civil War. They started coming on steamboats from New York, and they would stop at Savannah and then come into Jacksonville, and then they'd get on river boats and come all the way to Enterprise. It's what you did when you came to Florida in the 19th century. And the most famous of all these healing resorts in the age of spas on the St. Johns River was Green Cove Springs. It was called the Saratoga of the South. And you can just see how big a deal it was in this rendering. The spring there is a 3rd magnitude spring. It's teeny tiny in terms of flow, but it reeked of sulfur, and that's what everybody wanted back then. And you can see, Clay County and Green Cove Springs was all agriculture before they started developing the tourism industry. So this entire town sprang up, and all the resources there, the hotels, because of the spring and the people flocking to the spring to take the waters, which means drinking and soaking in the waters. Look at all the steamboats. Can you imagine seeing all that number of steamboats on the St. Johns River? I love this image. So this notion of healing waters, if you go across all the cultures throughout history, there's an idea that water is sacred and mysterious, and it must be because gods and goddesses who inhabit the springs. So there's the root origins of going to waters for healings comes from spiritual beliefs throughout the world. This is the Ganges, and this is, people, and they still believe that Ganges is sacred water, and they take pilgrimages there to bathe in that water. And it's found throughout the Bible. This is the pool of Bethesda. And the story is here that angels would trouble the water. And if you jumped in right when the water was troubled, you would be healed. And to me, that looks a whole lot like the boil at De Leon Springs, for instance. And there's stories again and again and again about healing water throughout the Bible. But the notion of sacred origins and healing waters kind of changed in the era of enlightenment, because they started to believe that science was behind everything. So in the 17th and 18th century, you started seeing books like this that talked about minerals and chemistry, and that's what healed you. So by the time they got to Florida, that's what they were looking for, that murky, milky water. A great example is De Leon Springs. No place in Florida has a better recorded history of human interactions with the spring than De Leon Springs. We know Panton and Leslie, who was the trading outfit who traded with the Seminoles, owned the land there first. But William Williams, who was a planter, came there, and he called it Spring Garden originally, and he owned it and his descendants. He sold it to Orlando Rees. Orlando Rees was the first one to build the mill there. We know that there is a huge indigenous population. I don't know, it's huge, but there was indigenous people who lived around there, because this house that's right next to De Leon Springs is built on a shell mound, and you can still see it today. And they dug out 2 canoes. Reportedly, one was 6,000 years old, one was 8,000 years old. A long history of Native Americans. Not Bartram, Audubon came around in 1832 when it was run by Orlando Rees. And he said, the water is quite transparent, although of a dark color, but so impregnated with sulfur that it emits an odor which was very disagreeable and highly nauseous. I've never smelled that at De Leon Springs, but for the right person, that's an opportunity. And the right person came along. A guy named Norris came from New York. His brother owned a steamboat, and he turned it into a spa. And you can see early bathhouse facilities in the background, and they promoted it as a place for healing waters. So at first there was just a steamboat, then the railroad came along and started bringing these tourists down from the north to soak in and bathe in the water. To me, these people do not look like invalids, and I think that's an important point. A lot of the people who came down here were not invalids. They were people looking to have a good time and get out in the sun. But it's hard to know. It was really used for promotion heavily. This is a piece that's in the Spanish Mill restaurant, and it talks about, all the benefits of the water. The liver and kidneys are stimulated to greater activity and relieved of congestion. I wish they would take this out and put it in a museum, because I'm worried it's going to catch on fire or something, because it's such a great resource that talks about this there, and it equates the waters of Spring Garden or De Leon Springs as good as Clifton Springs, which was one of the famous spas up north. In the 1920s, they built this casino there, and it had hotel rooms and a ballroom, and they still kind of marketed it then. But in the age of the automobile, the healing waters part was less popular as the accessibility to being near the Dixie Highway grew, and people started coming there by car. That's what they really marketed. Here's some lessons we can learn. In the 1920s, they wanted to raise the level of the spring basin, so they attempted to do that, and the weight of the water was so heavy that it pushed the spring vent into a spring run. So what they're doing here in this picture is they're sealing that vent with concrete in order to get the spring vent back where it was before. You just don't mess with Mother Nature. In the 1920s land boom, they also had the whole place that's now a state park platted out to sell, so you could have little houses there. They called it the Fountain of Youth and Profit. Buy a lot there. And fortunately, I think what happened is the Depression came along, and that never really happened. But in the 1970s, again, nature as a commodity. Let's build high rises right next to De Leon Springs, this wonderful natural resource. Thank God that never happened, because it's one of my favorite places in the entire state. It's not just pancakes. Okay, a lot of it is pancakes. But it's a great spring. It's a lot of fun to go to. Recently, however, we got a great lesson that nature is in charge when these sinkholes popped up nearby and turned the whole spring brown. Because of the hydrogeology, all that stuff underground is connected. Nature is always in charge, and we need to finally figure out that we don't have dominion over it and do silly things like mess with it, because it's in charge. More lessons can be learned from the springs of Enterprise as well. This perhaps was the first place in Florida that had a hotel built next to it. The guy named Cornelius Taylor in the 1840s built a hotel next to Green Springs and talked about the healing waters there. Jacob Brock, the steamboat captain, came along later in the 1850s, and he recognized that as well, but he wasn't right next to Green Springs. And it was the place to go before the Civil War and regained popularity after the Civil War. We know Winslow Homer went there, and he, again, exemplifies the whole Garden of Eden principle of unity of nature, where he shows man and nature coexisting in harmony. But Ulysses S. Grant, who also stayed at the Barak House, exemplifies that other point of view, where he says, this, once we clear this swampland and get all the timber out of there, this will make great rice country. So at the same time, you see those two diametrically opposed point of views. Green Springs was the big spring there. There's a lot of little springs in the woods there that bubble up around, and I think they dug wells there. I think Benson Springs was probably a well at some point. And somebody wrote about it as a great curiosity, because when you look at the water, it's green as Niagara Falls. But when you take a glass of water, it's crystal clear. How is that? It's magical. And I still think there's a magic to it. This website said it's the crown jewel of Volusia County's park system. And what I love is the history there is interpreted so well and so perfectly. And it reminds me of the value of places like this and signage like that, because I am a great example of heritage tourism. I come to Volusia County, I live in Orange County, and when I want to learn more history or when I want to go to experience natural resources, I go to Volusia County. And you have an opportunity to renew these ECHO grants and Volusia Forever grants that come out of your tax bills. And my understanding is, now I don't pay these bills, it's a relatively small amount of money taken out every year. But I want to reinforce the connection between the environment and the economy here. It's a small investment you make, but I come to Volusia County several times a year. I eat in the restaurants, I shop in the stores because of the resources that you have that are encouraged and, I don't want to say exploited, but made better by the ECHO and Volusia Forever grants. I would urge you to continue that program. If you're going to vote, please vote for it. All right, New Spring, Blue Spring. So I said earlier that they look for the stinky, mucky springs, and Volusia Spring is one of, if not the strongest spring on the St. Johns River, one of the strongest. It's a first magnitude spring, and it was never really developed as a spa, but it was a steamboat stop, and it was quite unusual. Look at the two steamboats there. Gosh, to have a time machine, go back in time and see this era. You know, there's a big house by the owner. Is it Thornby? I can never remember the guy's name, and it's on top of a shell midden again. But what I want to talk about is this wonderful Jacques Cousteau special that was created in the early 70s that looked at the manatees that lived in Blue Springs. Back then, there was only 11 manatees that wintered there. Can you imagine that? And this special is still available on YouTube. And imagine this quote, symbols of arrogant power, casting lengthening shadows on the wilderness, in Jacques Cousteau's voice. He saw what was happening with Central Florida. This is before Disney, that he saw it was becoming developed and it was heading down this way. And it's a great special because it changed the way we perceived manatees. And all that came afterwards, you know, the development of the state park was because of the light shined on it by Jacques Cousteau. And it was incredibly powerful. It's hard to watch today because there's people riding manatees, and they talk about people who carved their initials on manatees and a rake that was stuck in the back. And that pains me to hear about that. But thank God that we have learned our lesson and that now hundreds of manatees come there. Maybe one day we'll tear down a dam and they can return to Silver Springs and there'll be more resources that the manatees can go to in the winter. This is an image that I found in the state archives that shows a pristine Blue Spring, and around the era Jacques Cousteau was there. I have a hard time actually believing this is Blue Springs because I've never seen the water look this blue and this pure. This is what it looks like. I can see a picture of Blue Springs and identify it immediately because it looks like lime Kool-Aid. This is the Blue Springs I know, and we know why it's like that. And Howard T. Odom Florida Springs Institute has done a recovery plan. You can find it on their website, and I'll post a link. At the end, it shows this map. All the orange on this map is built up urban development. And the circle is the spring shed. All the water that goes down into the aquifer comes up in Blue Springs. So you can see how developed the area is. And these are all the septic tanks. The red ones are the most dangerous. The lighter colored ones are the least dangerous. And you can see, you know, septic tanks contribute to the quality of Volusia Springs. So recently the governor talked about we're doing all these great things for springs, but $50 million is literally a drop in the bucket as to what's needed to replace the septic tanks in the state of Florida, just the ones near the outstanding Florida springs. And those are ones that have received a certain designation. And I originally had a slide in my presentation that talked about how they weren't going to be able to find the money to repair some of the septic tanks around Wekiwa Springs because it's imperiled just like Volusia Blue. But just within this last week, a couple of days ago, they found the money. It's, to me, it speaks to the power of local journalism and how important that is. If we want to save our environment and protect our Garden of Eden, local journalism is very, very important. And so they found the money, and this again is a drop in the bucket, but it's an important first step. Meanwhile, our state legislature is finding or talking about spending hundreds of millions, and we know it'll be billions by the time they're done, to build these roads to ruin, when they are just giving little drips and drabs to repairing our septic tank and repairing the infrastructure. And, you know, nobody wants these roads. Again, they're doing this to open up the state for more development. It's, again, the whole notion of estate as real estate, and it is something we own to have dominion over and want to develop. Do you want to talk about this, Jason, or should I keep moving on?
Yeah. So the roads to ruin and the toll roads. Yeah, there's certainly one of, I would say, one of the largest threats that we have with what's left of rural Florida within the peninsula, and up in the Swanee River. Within that basin, really in particular, that what we see, and it just happens over and over again, that when you put in the toll roads, that's going to end up with sprawl development, is going to kind of attract around them. And so, yeah, so this is really kind of a real question for what we want for the future of Florida. If we want to have kind of rural Florida and have our natural spaces, these roads are not going to be conducive for that. And we have lots and lots of empirical evidence to show that that's what's going to happen. We don't need the roads now. The arguments that are used for them for things like hurricane evacuation, I'm just going to say they're bogus. And so it's a matter if we want to use our taxpayer money to help kind of subsidize subdivisions in the future. And I just personally don't think that that's a good use of taxpayer funds.
Thank you. That I put well better than I could, much better than I could. I just think, again, you know, my whole idea is we need balance in our thinking. And we have this idea that, you know, the economy is the driving force, but, you know, I think it's been proven again and again, if we take better care of the environment, you know, that will affect the economy in a positive way. One more spring I want to talk about is Altamont Springs. You know, you drive through it all the time and you hardly ever stop to think, is there a spring in Altamont Springs? Well, there was. This was a hotel that was built in the 1880s between Lake Orienta and Lake Adelaide. And supposedly both of those were spring-fed lakes. And this hotel was known for the quality of its pure spring water. You can see the tank on the roof where they pipe the spring water right into the tank. And this was their spring house. I don't think anyone bathed there, but they owned Shepherd Springs, and it was near San Lando Spring, which was called Hoosier Springs. And people could take a horse and buggy and go there and take the waters, you know, soak in the waters. But I think they use this mainly for drinking waters. You can actually see a jug right there in their little Victorian spring house or bathhouse, spring house. But this is Altamont Spring today. They covered it up and put a parking lot there. And this is a parking lot like you'll see many places in Florida with just little islands and trees and miles of asphalt. And all the water that used to fall on this and recharge the aquifer now, you know, probably goes into a retention pond or back into the lake where it evaporates. The other day when I stopped by and saw Bartram Gardens, I stopped at the aquatic center. And as soon as I pulled in, I was blown away. I was looking at all the native plants and I thought, this is how a parking lot should be. The only thing that was paved was the handicap parking spots. Nothing was paved. It's pervious. all the water falling on this is either going to contribute to this wonderful little lake or perk back in the ground, which is you want. Okay, take it away, Jason. Tell us more about this facility.
Great. Let's go to the next slide if we can. And so with the stormwater pond, so we developed this site over the past 3 or 4 years. And with the picture that was there before, when we first arrived, kind of post-development, this is what the stormwater pond looked like. And Wendy Anderson, she's on this as well. And when we saw this, we both were like, this is not what a Water Institute stormwater pond should look like. And so, so if you go to the next slide here, so we got a grant through the state DEP, through the US EPA, and with all these other sponsors, and we decided that we were going to go ahead and convert this into a native stormwater pond. And so all the plants that we see, or at least most of them, are native plants. And so we went ahead and planted the banks. We got rid of all the grass. We put in some bee mat, floating mats there in the middle. So the idea is we're trying to create a thriving ecosystem within the stormwater pond, not just seeing the stormwater pond as a functional thing where or we have a fountain and then you say, okay, this is it. No, this is an ecosystem. This is something that it is helping to keep the stormwater from the lake, but it's an ecosystem just in and of itself. And so we've been very pleased to see all of the native plants and the pollinator plants, and you build it, then they will come. We can go to the next slide.
You see it?
Yeah, so I can see it now. So this is a swale. So this is also part of the stormwater system. And so this is where the stormwater would kind of bubble out. And so what we've done there, we've actually converted that into this rain garden. And we just weeded it yesterday. And so I wish I had a picture of it, but you can kind of just click to the next slide here. So now we have a bunch of native plants. It's like a little wetland. Again, the pollinators and birds have moved in. And so it's really amazing that just putting in a few native plants and taking away the lawnmowers, that how fast the ecosystem responds, and just the resilience of nature, that is just absolutely amazing. And so we can go to the next slide here. And so these are actually arriving in the next couple weeks. So we have a bunch of signs we're going to put on site just to describe. And so if we think of the built environment around Central Florida, we have all these retention ponds and all these subdivisions that have gone up. And the retention ponds have their use, and they're a huge improvement over what we used to do, which is stormwater would go straight into our rivers and lakes. But kind of traditionally, we just put a fence around them, or we'd mow them with grass and fertilize them and put a fountain. There's a whole new kind of movement that these are ecosystems, and we have built them, and we should have stewardship over these things that we've constructed, and we can make ecosystems out of them. And so this whole idea of green infrastructure is really what that's about. So we can go to the next slide. And so just more of what our sign is going to look like, kind of describing what stormwater, what happens with ponds, and the reason why we have all this kind of stormwater infrastructure, but really integrating it and having kind of a celebration of stormwater within the landscape. And it is a resource, and these can be thriving habitats. Let's go to the next slide. And it's just some more signs. So rain gardens, this is a really new concept that we're really trying to promote within the landscape, that anywhere where you have a water that's kind of accumulating within your landscape. And so sometimes what people will do is they'll want to fill it in, or they're worried that it's kind of soggy. No, you can actually put wetland plants. You can put irises, you can put cypress. And so having rain gardens kind of intermix within the urban landscape, these are beautiful as well. So they become attractors, and really thinking that water is a resource. We're not just trying to get it away from the built environment. No, we want to keep it within the built environment as much as possible, because we don't want that going into our lakes and streams. And we can create these beautiful kind of oases within the middle of the urban fabric. And we can go to the next slide. And so these are really cool, the bee mats, and so they float. And I've got the SU here with the drone picture, because I have to admit, it was quite a sell to our CFO of the university. They were pretty skeptical about the floating mats. And he's like, is this going to clog up the stormwater pond? No, it won't do that. But when we did the school spirit, the SU, then you can make these things in any shape. That helped to make the sale that, okay, yeah, this can be interesting, and this can be something just for school spirit. And so let's go to the next slide. And then with the shoreline. And so again, with stormwater ponds, that what we typically do right now, again, throughout Central Florida, is we mow right up to the edge of them. The grass clippings end up going into the pond, which is not good for the water quality. And so celebrating the shorelines and the plants that are along the shorelines and littoral zones, and how important that is for water quality, for habitat. And we've been thrilled with our pond that just planting the aquatic plants, and they've just thrived. And we don't have to mow there anymore. So this is something we should be doing again throughout Central Florida. I'm like an evangelist for this, that any stormwater pond that we have out there, we need to be thinking about how we can recoup that, how we can make it functional. Because oftentimes the ones that have been built back in the 80s, they're not doing what they're supposed to actually do anymore. There's actually nitrogen that's leaching from them. And so we need to really reclaim these and have, again, the stewardship ethic with everything that we've built. And so with that, the thing's back to Rick again.
That inspires me so much. Where I live, there are 2 retention ponds that one was recently restored, and they basically just firmed up the land around it and planted grass. And it's like, and there are hooded mergansers who winter on this retention pond that is nothing but, scum and algae and grass. And I just think the opportunity missed drives me crazy. All right, here's another great example. Wekiwa Springs, it was originally called Clay Springs, was a huge, historically was a huge resource. They were able to get shallow draft steamboats from the St. John's up the Wekiwa River. And at one point, there was a huge attraction. Jim Robeson, a historian, says this is Central Florida's first attraction, because if you see that thing that looks like a ladder on the left-hand side, that's actually a toboggan ride, and there was a skating rink and a ballroom. So people went there. There was a healing spa there at one point too, but it was really a recreational resource as much as anything else. And it's a big state park, and here's what it looks like today. You can see this slimy limestone, gross stuff, and there's a great restoration plan on the Florida Springs Institute website that talks about how we can try and restore this and the whole river. There's been a lot put into trying to keep the Wekiwa River healthy, and it's just not worked. Again, the septic tanks are a big part of that. This is a slide I did the design for that talks about the condition of a lot of our springs, that, basically the flow of most of the springs throughout the state is down a third, and that almost all the springs throughout the state are impaired to some degree. One of the solutions is this whole right to nature program. On the ballot here in Orange County, we have this charter question number 1 that says it would do 3 things. It would recognize the right to clean water for Orange County residents and the county's waterways like the Wekiwa and Econ-Waxahachie, and establish the ability of Orange County residents to bring legal actions to protect the right to clean water. And 3rd, guaranteed that water be restored after any pollution occurs. It's part of a bigger movement. There's also a state Florida Rights of Nature network, and the Rights of Nature movement really has 3 parts. Humans are an integral part of nature. It fits with the whole Garden of Eden concept that I'm espousing. 2, we have a fundamental responsibility to protect the long-term health of nature. If you're going to try and assert dominion over nature, you are responsible for taking care of it. 3, our current legal systems fail to recognize nature's right to exist and flourish. It's all based on land ownership. I think the indigenous people had it better when they didn't see any land ownership, and that's a big lesson we can learn from them. There are a lot of other things that I see are positive. This is an Orange County thing that is trying to establish the connection between people's yards and the springs, and I see this advertising, and it's cute and it's well done, and I think people are starting to finally get, that our springs are going to be gunky if you put a lot of fertilizer in the yard, but not nearly enough. There is within us an innate desire to be near, to be in, to see,
to be around water. And I think developers recognize that. This is something called a crystal lagoon that they're starting to build around the state, that you kayak on and do stand-up paddleboard on and swim in, anything you would do in a normal lake, but it's basically a giant swimming pool. It is sanitized nature. And I love what Bill Belleville said. Water has become the visual muzak, and this is muzak to me. This is, sanitized nature. But I also believe that, there's something in our DNA. We want this desire to be in water is so much a part of who we are today that we can't ignore it. And this is something called indigo float, which is kind of this deprivation pod with all these minerals in the water like Epsom. And Epsom goes back to those early healing spas they had in England. Epsom was actually a town in England where there was a healing spa. And the results of taking the waters in these modern day alternatives are really similar to what you would have had in the 19th century spa in Florida. And that whole sacred spiritual notion, I think, can help us get to a place where we have a deeper experience in nature that's, more than the kind of recreational use of nature. That's what's going to make us take care of the water, that we need to take time to develop that relationship with those watery places around the state. Another way of looking at it is from the environmentalist journalist named Cynthia Barnett, who wrote this pamphlet where she said we need to create a water ethic for Floridians that allows us to value our water better. And the values that she's saying we need to personify are economic responsibility, cooperation, thriftiness, and maturity. Things that right now are hard for our society to do, but if we want to save the water, we can do it. We use a lot less water than we did just 10 or 20 years ago. We are doing a good job. But the hard thing is 1,000 people a day are moving into Florida, and there are so many straws in the aquifer that, the ripple effect of more water coming out of the aquifer is profound. But there's opportunity. I came across this person, and she, in this quote, exemplifies what I talk about, the whole commodification of nature, as the modern civilization since the Industrial Revolution has rested on subjugating nature through resource extraction. Resource extraction, one of those resources has been water. Commercial agriculture, exploiting land, and piecemeal implementation of mitigation strategies. So we are at a point where all these things are happening right now. The rights of nature movement, these roads to nowhere, where we can choose differently, and it's up to us to do it. The eco grants, I think, are a great opportunity. The economic part and the environmental part need to go hand in hand. I love the idea of what Yopon Brothers are doing with their tea, because they see this as a sustainable alternative to agriculture. Because Yopon holly is a native Florida plant. It grows here by itself. So you don't need to water it. You don't need a fertilizer. And they see this perhaps someday as supplement or taking the place of citrus in the state. Could you imagine that? And that people will find work picking the little leaves off the tree, so it could be an economic driver. We need to find more industries like this that don't hurt our economy, but help our environment. A great example was of how we need to change our attitudes towards water. I was in St. Augustine last week on a tour with the Florida Trust for Historic Preservation, and the boat captain was saying all these goofy jokes, but he was laying on us some real heavy environmental stuff about how black mangroves are creeping north. And at one point, you never found them that far north, but how they were good for the environment because of the amount of carbon they held. And this guy, he was telling us all these hokey jokes, I found out was actually very enlightened, and he owned a fish camp and was a businessman, and he was running for Congress. And he gave me this great quote: clean water is our state's true economic driver. That's why businesses call it cash flow. That's why we must protect it for deeper reasons as well as the shallow monetary reasons. And part of his territory is Volusia County, so vote for the guy if you can, because one of his big planks on his platform is clean water. We need to elect people like this if we want to preserve our water resources. And this is the deeper reasons. I love this quote too. We live our environment. We don't just drink, wash, or sail and swim. We live water. And we need to understand that we are connected to the water, and that when we are restoring the health of the water, we are restoring our own health. And that connection cannot be underestimated. Bill Belleville needs to get the last word. We need to feel it. It needs to be emotional for us. We need to reclaim that link that the indigenous people had, in that understanding that people who came here on steamboats in the 19th century, that our water can heal us, and it needs to be deeper than just the intellectual reasons, that we need to feel the importance of doing that. I'm going to end it there because we're probably way over time, just 5 minutes, and thank our sponsors and open it up to Jason. We have questions. If you're a Stetson student, go ahead and email this address, and we will be happy to answer any questions you have. And I'm also going to put some links in the comments, or Steve will, some of the things I talked about, like the Jacques Cousteau video. So go ahead and fire away if you have any questions to the comments or the question thing. I'm going to stop.
There's already been a couple comments that have come in here.
Okay.
Got one here from Henry Pate, and he was asking about the shellfish and snail populations within the St. Johns River and along the Huntoon Island area. So Rick, do you have any?
That's outside my realm of expertise. I do know this. There are certain types of snails that are endemic to our springs. You only find them around our springs. And that's another argument for preservation, because if our springs degrade further, once there's more nitrogen and phosphorus going in our springs, the algae blooms and the native grasses and stuff that used to flourish there no longer can, and the snails will go away. That's about all I know. Yeah. That's a good question. That's really a biology question. I'm sorry, I can't answer that.
Yeah, so I can answer at least something. I put something in the chat box or within the comment box that the snails within our little area, the Huntoon Island area, the Lake Beresford, over the past 15, 20 years, the exotic apple snails have completely taken over. So the native apple snails are still there, but they are declining. And so it's a big problem with the exotic apple snails for the native apple snails. But then on the other hand, the limpkin population has increased just dramatically. So limpkins used to be kind of a rare bird.
Yeah.
But now they have figured out how to use the exotic apple snails. And I see them actually at the aquatic center. We have huge populations of limpkins, and they're eating the exotics. And so that's one of these kind of counterintuitive things to where that's not to say that we want to have a lot of exotic species in Florida, but this is one of those stories to where the exotic snails are actually feeding and actually increasing the limpkins. But in terms of the other shellfish and snails, I don't really know an answer to that either, unfortunately, Henry. I can try to find that, though. I can talk to some of my friends in the biology department.
Yeah, that would be great. I see a lot of questions about native plants. My favorite place for native plants in the state is called Green Isle Gardens in Groveland. It is just native plants, and they have a huge, huge collection. I don't know how far Groveland is for you guys, but it's like I'm a kid in a candy store when I go there. I usually stop when I filled my car.
Yeah,
it's that wonderful. And I also see Lou Merritt asked a question about that picture of Blue Springs. It was taken by the Chamber of Commerce, the State Chamber of Commerce, and I'd like to think they know what they're doing, but just because it's in the state archives identified as something doesn't mean it's true. I found that several times. They only know when a donation is made what's written on it. So it could be Gilchrist Blue. There's probably 6 or 8 different Blue Springs in the state, so it's easy to get them confused. So what about native plants, Jason? Where do you guys go for native plants?
I was to say the same thing there, the Green Isle. And there are some other vendors around that have native plants. Beeman's Nursery is the one that we received all of our plants.
Cool.
For the aquatic center. And so they really specialize in a lot of the wetland vegetation. And so if you're trying to do any kind of lake or wetland restoration. They are a really good source. They're over here in Volusia County. And yeah, someone had mentioned kind of big box stores, and you can sometimes find a native plants within the big box. But I've also found, even when they do have native plants, they don't seem to thrive all that well. The cultivars they use, and sometimes a lot of the native plants that we have in Florida, the populations of those plants can go actually pretty far north. And so you want to have ones that are well adapted to Central Florida. And so going to places like Green Isle and going to our local natives, those are really the places to go. The nurseries that are going to be local, they're going to try to find the biotypes that are going to be a lot more local to us.
And just, you know, I can speak for Green Isle Gardens. There's stuff I've never seen or never heard of. And, you know, I so many impulse buys when I go there. But, you know, it's like you might find Counties at Bose and Home Depot, but you're not going to find a lot of that. You know, I'm going to go back to the slide you had and get some of those, because I have a swale in my yard because I live on a lake to try and keep the water from running off into it. And I was going to put rocks there, but now after seeing your stuff, I'm going to get some of those native plants and try and make it into a rain garden, because it's a great opportunity to get certain kind of plants that need to be wet.
Yeah. And so even just as like a hint with those irises, the native irises, and then the cannas, the native cannas, they're almost bulletproof if you have a little bit of wetness, because they can take some dry and wet, and they're flowers. You get the blue flowers and the yellow flowers. And so that's what we've used within our rain garden, and they've just absolutely thrived. And we even planted them when it was really dry. So they will work really, really well.
I see a question from Ann Patton asking, what's the one thing you would change in Florida to move us in this direction? It's could I change all the elected officials and replace them with new ones? Because you know, I think the roads to ruin thing is a great example of just how misdirected we are. I think they are acting out of a dated paradigm, that let's just fill up every inch of the state with, development. And, I'm so sure that there's a tie between the environment and the economy. And I think we see it again and again. And we alter that, at our own risk. We risk, the stupid algae blooms, the red tide that they had a couple of years ago in South Florida are a great example of that, or the oil spill on the Gulf. All those businesses that derive their income for the clean water are at risk of going out of business when we make environmental decisions, that treat the land as only a resource or the natural materials.
And so let's see, we have a whole bunch of questions over here too in the Q&A.
Oh, okay.
Let's see here. So Jane Goddard, what is Stetson doing to show the public and developers and politicians what a healthy eco-effective retention pond can look like? Seeing is believing. So that's a great comment. And so with the Aquatic Center, we are going to try to educate with the signage and try to do some programs to talk about the practices that we're doing, and working with contractors. Again, kind of Beeman's, I'll just give them another shout out because they were out yesterday and they were weeding the pond and helping. And so there were some of even with the native weeds. And so some people, that where we're trying to find the sweet spot between wild and kind of cultivated. And so there can be this perception that if you have a native landscape, it's going to be weedy, it's be dangerous. And a lot of people don't want that. But then there is a whole kind of movement right now within landscape design. And there's a symposium that we had this last week. It's actually called the Outside Symposium. And it's a group of landscapers, landscape professionals, even developers, some of the local government officials, and some of the nursery professionals are trying to get the paradigm out that we can do this native landscaping in ways that is beautiful, and it's not more expensive, and And if we really think about the true cost of what we're doing now with the St. Augustine lawns and the fertilizers, it's incredibly expensive because we're not factoring in the algae blooms within our lakes, within our springs, and the water use. And it's about 40% of the public water that we use within Florida is going to lawns, to irrigate lawns. And I actually teach whole lessons and whole units in my class, environmental science, that to me, it's just the most wasteful, incredibly weird thing that we do within our modern society, that these lawns. And so if there's one thing I could change, I'll say with Rick again, with kind of policies, but the one thing I think anyone could do is get rid of your lawn or kind of minimize it and go and try to get native plants in and think about everything you're putting out there on your yard. You are a part of the problem and you're also part of the solution.
Yeah.
Everybody. And that's how we can empower ourselves. And so we're going to try to do that at Stetson with these ponds, to say, here's how we can be stewards.
Yeah. I see another question. Somebody said in the comments, thanks for mentioning Yopon tea and regenerative farming. How can we shift the conversation among farmers to embrace regenerative farming techniques and crops? I don't know a whole lot about that, but I would say if Yopon Brothers tea is a big success and they start to grow, other people are going to want to do what they're doing. The big corporations will want to follow in. That's how business works. When one person, it's like probably what happened with these spas on the St. Johns River. The first one was Magnolia Springs and it was doing well. So Green Cove Springs pops up and, so the imitation is what happens. So if you drink more Yopon Brothers tea, I think that can go a long way to help shifting that argument. And, I think citrus greening is, I don't know if they'll get a handle on that, but I think the days of citrus being that big, but the reality also is that, the number one crop in the state of Florida is turf grass. And that's a huge thing. And if we get more and more people planting native plants in their backyard and the demand increases, there will be a shift to growing native plants, because some of the native plants I've only found at a couple of nurseries. They're hard to get.
And so there's a lot of questions about retention ponds and with native plants and gardening. And so I would say, let's see, the Outside Collaborative. I'm just going to go ahead and give them a shout out, and I'll go ahead and put that link up because they're what they're really trying to do, and this links up with another question that has to do with stewardship and water, and how do we talk with people like developers who might claim this is too costly. And what the Outside Collaborative is trying to show is that with the proper design, that it can be less costly, even upfront for the developers to actually preserve some of the natural lands and do cluster development and then use native plantings within their developments. And then as it turns out, people will pay more for that because of the quality of life, and it becomes a selling feature. And if you can imagine eco subdivisions maybe, and actually doing it in a way that's real. Of course, one of the things that's always driven me crazy too about growing up in Florida is you get a new subdivision and it'll be called something like Panther Preserve. And it's like, that's where the Panthers used to live, right? Or it's going to be like Oak Hammock Preserve. It's like, that used to be an oak hammock. But to actually really do that, to say, okay, we're going to have eco subdivisions and creating that market niche. And, it's a big haul, but there are some people within Central Florida and even some developers that are thinking about that. And I think it's at least partly because there are even builders and developers that, of course, love the waters. And so they want to do the right thing. But also, if there is a profit margin and they think they can find that market, then just like we've seen all throughout Florida history, if we can somehow align the stewardship with this idea of dominion to say, okay, here's how we can still make profit while cleaning up the environment. That's how we'll get a real big paradigm shift, I think, soon. That's what keeps me kind of optimistic. I don't want to say optimistic. I mean, but yes, but I guess close to optimism, the thinking that we can do this, and there are people that are trying to do this. And so let me go ahead and put that link up here.
Somebody said Yopon Brothers could be the new Starbucks. Locally, we have a chain that's a local coffee house chain called Foxtail, and that's what they use exclusively as their tea is Yopon Brothers. So again, go to frequent places that and buy that tea, and I think it'll help. Use the power of your wallet to influence decisions. Yeah, so somebody asked about the outside collaborative link. Working on that.
Yeah, I'm working on that right now.
Somebody said that the idea of calling subdivisions places like Oak Hammock is eco-assassinating. I love that, eco-assassinating. And a lot of them are named after springs too, which is another thing. I think John Moran at one point was trying to keep an inventory of all the places named after springs that never exist, in places that are actually going to contribute to the demise of the springs. Eco-assassinating. What else? Any more? I can't seem to get the questions.
Let's see.
There's
one here. Are there groups out there for creating ecosystems out of retention ponds? And I'll give another shout out here to Wendy Anderson. She is my colleague here at Stetson. She was the chair for the Environmental Sciences Department for about 6 years, and she's still here at Stetson as a professor. She's really actively working with her HOA here, Victoria Park. And so it's a subdivision, and she is actively trying to organize right at the HOA level. And there are some other groups in Central Florida. Again, I'll try to find some links. For example, City of Orlando and Chris Castro, he's the sustainability director for the City of Orlando. He's really into this. And so he's a wonderful resource, and he just is out there again as kind of like an evangelist for all sorts of sustainability issues. But this idea of the retention ponds, and they can be these resources for native plants and for native ecosystems. So those are two of the people that I know about that are kind of the thought leaders in Central Florida. And so Wendy, if you don't mind, I'm going to put up your email address in here too. So people can reach out to you. And then Wendy is also running for the Volusia County Soil and Water Conservation District. And so I'm going to give her a plug there that she's on the ballot. And this is part of what she is talking about. And one of her big issues is again, the retention ponds. And so she is a wonderful resource. And I see that she's saying thanks, that she's okay with having her email out here. So I'm going to go ahead and put Wendy, then she just put the link for her campaign. I'm also going to give you her Stetson email.
Someone asked, what is the one thing all Floridians could do to help our water? I mean, there's a certain consciousness you need to have when you use water. Don't run the water when you brush your teeth, and, when you're doing dishes and stuff like that, that you always need to have. But we talked a lot about native plants. I water them in when I get them to get them established, but after that, I let them go. I think mine has gone over to the wild side recently, but I still, the joy that it brings me when I have a really interesting plant and I haven't seen the bloom. I mean, I'll tell you, the first thing I do as soon as it's light every morning is I go and look for new blooms, because some of these things I buy based on the name, and I have no idea what the flower is going to look like. And there's that whole kind of surprise element when they finally start to bloom. And the blooms to me are far more exotic and interesting than regular tropical plants, exotics that we plant around our yard. They're so much more like bee balm. I mean, what an interesting bloom that is. And you had them all over the place when I stopped by the aquatic center. And when I was there, it was incredible because there was an interpretive panel about birds in Bartram. And just beyond that panel, there was a big hawk sitting on the ground. And then there was an interpretive panel about, cultivators and pollinators. and there was a huge monarch caterpillar on one of the milkweeds there. And it's remarkable when you see the sign, the interpretive signage, and then you see the real thing in real life. And maybe that's part of it, is getting people to I think about that class I took with Bill Belleville, and I think about when I went to Huntoon Island recently. The first time I went to Huntoon Island, I kind of had a Fitbit mentality where I was like, let's do all the trails as fast as we can, and then I'll do 4.2 miles or whatever. Now I take the time to stop. And when I was at Huntoon Island, I stopped to take a picture, and I noticed these little red things on the ground, and I didn't know what they were. And I got on my hands and knees, and they were these teeny little star-shaped carnivorous plants with little sticky drops of what looked like dew on the end of the end. They were remarkable. And that's the kind of discoveries you make when you kind of come at nature from a deeper level, that you stop and make it a meditative experience as opposed to just trying to count steps. And I think that somehow if we get people to slow down in nature, they're going to have that emotional connection with it, which will make them want to do more than plow it under. So
let's see. So we have some more questions, and if we have time, Rick, I know this
keep going.
11, but I'm happy to keep hanging out. And so there's one here. Why is water quantity and quality divided by laws? And I've got the same answer. I think it's kind of historically, we just had this division, and it ends up being a real problem within the regulatory system, that the water management district, when they're doing the minimum flows and levels, they're not really considering the water quality side. And then when the DEP and they're doing the BMAPs and they're going in and doing the restoration for water quality, the water quantity is not part of that conversation necessarily. And we know that they're linked, and we know that the ecosystem responses that we see with some of the algae growth and some of the issues are intricately related to the water flow as well. So when the flow of the springs goes down, then that increases the amount of time that the nutrients that we're also adding can react, and then you end up with algae. And so these things in truth are not at all separate. And so I always go with kind of science and law. Law is its own body of logic, and we would hope that with environmental law, it is informed by science, but the laws are what they are. And so it really comes to changing the laws, and how do we actually get those things to merge within the regulatory system. And the why, I think it's just a lack of knowledge historically, and now that it's more convenient to do it that way.
I think it's just the paradigm the whole time, that we've had this kind of European outlook, I'm saying European for the last 500 years, that water is a commodity and it's a resource. All the natural systems are resources, which goes into the next comment from Lou Merritt, who says, what if we replace the word resources and with something like systems or living systems? Because I think that all goes to that whole rights of nature thing, because the government, the legislative stuff is all coming from that land rights perspective, that nature is a commodity to be bought and sold. That if we go to these are living systems, and we're part of that living system, and we have to be stewards of that, it's kind of turning the whole thing on its head. It would be a huge paradigm shift, but we have to start electing people who see it that way. I hope your colleague gets the soil and water board. And I don't know that the guy in St. Augustine has much of a chance, but it pains me when I see politicians act like they're environmentally conscious, only at times of election. And, all their work up until that point has been contrary to that. And we need to find people who really, aren't just greenwashing. They really walk the walk and talk the talk at the same time.
All right. Let's see. Are there any more questions that we should address here, Rick, that you've seen? And so I've seen Yeah, so I think we've hit it, the one here about kind of natural resources and even that term of resources that almost sounds like a Dominion type term.
There was one question about statewide program to modify retention ponds to be native gardens. To me, that's a local thing mostly. Well, I guess if it's a state road or something, they may be responsible for it. I think it varies.
Yeah, so the water management districts have some programs where they do try to encourage this. And
Okay.
so there are some education programs. And so this is just my thought, is that we should go, especially with state projects, we should be mandating it within state project, because right now it's a lot of voluntary type work. And so, the paradigm really is to do it the traditional way, because that's what everyone understands. But I think with state and local governments, that if they want to take it seriously, that with new projects, to really commit to doing it that way. I mean, to really kind of walk the walk and say, we are going to do it this way. And that maybe will help to shift the way things go. And so that's what I support, is to really kind of move in that direction. So with that, yeah, any other questions anybody has here? So I see there's a plug here for Gemini Springs Alliance, working to restore the Gemini Springs Marsh. And there is some work out there with harvesting invasive species, and that is a great project. And so watch and stay tuned for that. And so with that, Rick, do you have any final thoughts?
Well, Lou Merritt said, do we want to form an informal working bar to really dig into what's required to change the paradigm? Get a bunch of people to brainstorm ideas. I'm always up for that. And, you mentioned Chris Castro. I would like to give he came from this organization that started at UCF called Ideas for Us. And they do something called The Hive once a month. And I think it's probably virtual now, but it used to be in person. But there is this, group, and they're into fleet farming and all this kind of stuff, and give them a plug that there are a lot of people who are working on these solutions on a wider level, and they're young and energized and make you feel hope. So I would say keep hope alive and go out and enjoy nature.
All right, guys. Well, thank you so much for everything. Thanks for everyone that came out here on your Saturday. And I really enjoyed it, Rick.
Me
and,
too.
Thanks, Kelly, for leading us off. And thanks to the Volusia Water Alliance for this program. And there will be more programs coming up over the next few months. And so just stay tuned.
That's right. That's right. And let me just, let me thank Rick and Jason for leading us through this discussion today. A lot of fascinating ideas. And I actually posted the Volusia Water Alliance email address in the chat, because I know for me, I got an awful lot of topic ideas of things I wanted to know more about. And so if other people are having the same experience, just let us know what you think about future topics. As Jason just said, stay tuned, because we will have more sessions in the virtual symposium series. And want to remind our Stetson students again to email me at sgentile@stetson.edu in order to receive your cultural credit. I won't be able to get that credit for you unless I have your ID number. So again, thanks you guys. This has really been great to see Sharon on the screen now. Thanks for putting all of this together. Thanks to Stephen Kintner. And can we get our sponsor slide up, do you think? So that we can properly thank our sponsors for enabling us to be able to put this program on for you today.
It's going to take some doing.
Oh, well.
I can do it. I can do it. There it is.
Okay.
Zoom.
All right. There we are. Very good.
And just a shout out
Okay.
to Gemini Springs Alliance. I see Sandra Gray had a comment in there. They're doing good work, and that's a very important spring that Bartram stopped at.
Yeah. Well, there really are a lot of people doing a lot of good work, and a lot of folks putting their brains together to make one big brain that will hopefully be able to figure out some of this stuff. But I think also, a comment about the energy of young people coming into this work is so important, especially right now.
Agreed.
And so if you want to get involved and you just don't know how, drop us a line and we'll be happy to reach out to you. Okay? All righty. Well, thanks everyone. That concludes our program for today. And we hope to see you again very soon. Have a good weekend.
See y'all
Thank
later.
you.
Thank you.